Hi, this is James Hudson for RunItOnce.com, and this is a slightly different video today where I'm going to be four-tabling Zoom stakes from 10 cent, 25 cent all the way up to 1-2, and kind of just try and point out some of the differences that I think there might be between the different stakes and ways that you can kind of exploit those differences, and maybe even some things to look for when you're moving up. But I figure in the interim, let's just jump into the footage. There we go. So ace-queen bottom right is going to be a hand that I'm going to be 3-betting versus pretty much everyone's cutoff open. And he's playing 26-22, so he certainly doesn't seem like he's a super nit or anything. If he 4-bets, I'd probably be jamming over the top, though I think you can certainly make a case for flatting as well. You're going to have a weird kind of opponent to be 3-betting for value and then folding to the 4-bet. But it's certainly something that you might see with certain recreational players where you expect them to call the 3-bets really light, but not to be 4-bet bluffing hardly at all. So one of the biggest things that I think you should be doing at especially these smaller stakes, and I'll pause it for a second just to talk about this, is that I think you should be trying to see as many flops as possible, especially when you're in position, and trying to steal as much from the button as possible, just because people are making a lot of mistakes. I mean, they're making mistakes pre-flop, but they're certainly making much bigger mistakes post-flop, I think, a lot of the time. And if you get in there with position and initiative, you're going to be able to exploit those mistakes that they're making. But also, unlike in higher stakes games, when you open loose on the button in these smaller stakes games, you're going to find that people respond by calling a lot more than they would by 3-betting. So you're getting to realize your equity far more often, and you can see similar tendencies in post-flop play as well, where you should expect them to be calling more often than they would be check raising, for instance. So far more often you're going to get to the river with the weaker parts of your range and be able to realize equity than you would in more aggressive games where you should expect to be both 3-bet pre-flop and then check raise more on the flop, which kind of takes away from the value of stealing with some of the weaker hands in your range. Anyway, bunch of hands in everywhere else. 3-bet, or we get 3-bet with the 8-10 suited here. I think it's a hand that makes total sense to be defending, or you can make a case for defending it anyway if he was 100 big blinds deep, but obviously at that stack depth there's no way we're going to get involved. Pocket 9s in the top right is a spot where it's difficult, obviously. Well, I mean, it's borderline impossible to get called by worse hands on the flop, except for maybe some flush draws. But our hand basically never improves unless we bank a 9 on the turn. And the pre-flop raiser's checked 4 ways. And especially at the lower stakes, I think it's far less likely that he's checking to be tricky or to check raise. So I think we can pretty much discount him, and then the blinds are going to have wide-ish ranges because they just called pre-flop after I already called, so the action was 3 and 4 ways. So they're likely to come along with weaker hands. But basically, I'm just going to stab once probably and just be done with it, I think, in this spot, just because if I don't bet here, it's going to be very difficult to win a showdown when I give up 2 free cards versus 3 different sets of hands. So I'm just going to take a stab here, I think, and then, yeah, basically just to try to take it down. If I do get called, or if I get check raised, I'm obviously done with my hand. If I get called, I'll have to make some decisions on the turn. If I get called by the pre-flop raiser, his range is going to be a lot more defined than if I get called by the blinds, because he's going to be check calling hands like weak queens and pocket jacks, pocket tens, and stuff like that. Whereas the blinds are far more likely to have draws. So bottom right, I like to lead with a hand that has some backdoors. I could choose to check raise with this hand, but the villain's only c-betting 45%, so I don't really want to be check raising a hand this weak into a range that's as strong as 45%. And I think I just have a little bit too much stuff going on to just want to check fold. Also, I mean, he's opening the button at 46%, which isn't crazy loose, I guess. So, I mean, I could just check fold here, I guess, but I'm okay with this. Other hands, I defend a 4x open with ace-king. I don't have any stats on this guy yet, and he's 4xing, so I think three betting would probably be a fairly big mistake, and without knowing anything about the villain. Generally, when people 4x, I tend to play my range a little bit more cautiously than I normally would, just because I don't know anything about them, but they're building a huge pot to begin with. It's a lot easier to get stacks in when you 4x than when you 3x, because I mean every bet that goes in subsequently is going to be bigger. And I just don't feel the need to juice the pot. I wouldn't probably be 3-betting versus most middle position opens in the spot anyway with ace-king. So yeah, basically, I mean that's kind of standardish. Obviously, if I get squeezed though, I'm just gonna back raise, get it in, unless Tom Sky ends up putting in a 4-bet himself, in which case I think it's pretty easy to get away from my hand. Top right, I have 2 overcards and the Queen of Spades, so I'm certainly not going to be folding. I don't really want to check raise, just because I think I end up isolating myself versus the stronger parts of his range, and end up running into kind of like overpairs, bigger spade draws than mine, and then sets, I think, a lot of the time. So that doesn't really do too much for me, except for kind of make my hand easier to play versus the air parts of his range, but I'd rather just keep those in. And if I hit a jack or a queen, I'll probably be calling down, and same thing with a spade. We'll definitely call in the turn on a spade and then deciding on the river, but, you know. Bottom right, we get a kind of bad card on the turn. Once he calls the flop, he's pretty likely to have a hand that connects with that in some way, either by hitting a pair and a straight draw, or 2-pair, or top pair. So I'm pretty much done here. Had it been a club, I probably just would have kept on betting, because I got the blocker, and obviously I have equity as well. But once that card hits, even though I pick up equity, I end up, picking up the idiot end of a gut shot. So I think it's fine to just check fold there, especially given that the button's not opening particularly loose to begin with, which means that he's going to have more hands that are connected. So he's not going to have as many junky kind of like 9-3 suiteds and 10-6 suiteds and stuff that might be able to find a fold somewhere along the way, and he's more likely to hit this turn consequently. Bottom left, we c-bet with pocket nines and get min check raised. If the board was drier, I think that you can make it, like, you should probably just be slow playing. So like if the board was say 9-5-2 rainbow or something like that, but given that it's 9-6-4 two-tone, I think I'm best just shoveling money in. I don't think villain's pretty much ever folding to a 3-bet here, just because there's too much stuff that has equity to continue. So I think my 3-bet shouldn't be overly small here. I'm hoping I make it at least 22, 23 at least, but I wouldn't hate it if I went bigger. I think a lot of the time he's going to be able to have combo draws here, or obviously he can have worse sets, and then, maybe some junky 2-pairs. I have no stats on him, and it doesn't look like he was, he might have been bought in full, I'm not sure. So I make it 24, and I'm okay with that sizing, I think. Okay, so quickly, top right now, villain bets again, and I have 2 overs, a gut shot, and the queen high flush draw. It's an overcard, so I think it's perfectly reasonable for villain to be double barreling. I think I end up check raising here. I think I could potentially even just call the turn, and that might be better considering that villain isn't bought in full, which means he's more likely to be kind of stationy and less aggressive post flop. So when he does bet the turn, it actually probably means a decent amount more, and I'm not sure he necessarily folds a hand like 8-7 with the 7 of spades, for instance. Calling might be the better play than check raising here. Yeah, I don't think I noticed his stack size at the time. One thing you'll notice is I definitely make mistakes in this video, not paying attention to stack sizes, because I'm playing 4 different stakes at the same time while 4-tabling Zoom. So that ends up making it a little bit more complicated, and I definitely need to pay more attention to stack sizes if I'm going to be doing stuff like that. So anyway, I go ahead and check raise. He calls, and then we get a blank on the river. And I think I'm probably better off just giving up here. He can certainly have some stuff like ace x of spades, king x of spades with, a little bit of something else, maybe like a pair in that, or even just like the naked ace of spades. But given that I know absolutely nothing about him, I'm fine with just giving up here. I also don't block the nut flush either, which is one of the more likely hands for people to slow play once they get raised. So if I had that, I might be more likely to, like the Ace of Spades blocker, I might be more likely to follow through with a bluff here, just because it kind of takes away a bunch of the hands that he's likely to slow play on the turn and that he's guaranteed to call me with on the river. Top left, just c-bet the top two and get a fold, nothing too interesting there. Now Villain's getting kind of silly with his bet sizing on the bottom left. He's obviously not folding. So I think I can just jam it in now. He's put in, almost half his stack. And he's going to be getting way too good a price to fold pretty much anything at this point, so I think I just need to jam it in there. I don't want to give him a chance when he has a hand like 9-6 or 6-4 to get away from it on the turn when, a diamond that completes a straight draw comes out or something like that. Even though, there's no guarantee he's folding there, but I'm certainly making it a lot easier on him, whereas when I just stick the money in on the flop, I'm almost guaranteed to get all the money in there. Top left, like I said, just trying to open the buttons fairly wide. Jack-6 suited isn't, anything crazy or anything, though. Just going to c-bet the flop just because, basically my hand play is pretty tough to check back and then call straights. And like I said, I think you can get away with a decent amount of just kind of like opening wide and stabbing in the smaller stakes games. And that's probably what most people should be trying to do. Especially when we're talking about late position play where I think most people just aren't defending wide enough. And when they do defend, chances are they're not playing super awesome out of position from the blinds with wide ranges. Bottom left, get 3-bet from an unknown. He's got kind of a shorter stack. Once I call, basically, if I get if I hit a king or a jack, I'm basically just going broke given his stack size. I don't think anything else really makes too much sense. Maybe folding pre-flop if he's super nitty, but I just don't know anything about him, so it's tough to make that read. Top left, I 3-bet ace-king suited, versus a shorter stack, and get a pretty bad flop, and I'm just going to check fold. He ends up checking back, and now I'm just kind of praying that we get to check it down versus, king-queen or something. But I don't think he's going to let us. Bottom right, I could consider check raising here with the 5-6 just because Villain's kind of capped his range, and we can certainly have queen-jack. And then we block combos of a6, which is one of the more likely hands that he checks back and can kind of take heat on the turn. But it's not a board where I want to get crazy out of line, just given that this board in general doesn't hit me too hard after I defend out of the big blind versus a button open. I'm just not going to be slow playing any kind of ace king, kings, aces, tens here, just hardly ever. So I'm okay with just folding there. Calling just doesn't make too much sense, just because even when he checks back some of his weaker stuff, like say 10 jack, queen 10. Obviously that stuff still has me beaten. I have barely any equity, and then he certainly has a decent amount of aces that he checks back, so not too much I can do there. Top left, we check it down and get a 10 of spades on the river, and I think Villain's going to go ahead and bet here. Yeah, he bets 275 on the river, and he's a guy who wasn't bought in full. He defended a 3-bet and then checked down on a two-tone board with a 4 straight. My assumption at the time was that I didn't think he would be capable of value betting an 8 or 7 or 6 in all likelihood, though that does become slightly more likely when he uses a smaller bet sizing. I think a 10 probably puts in a bet on either the flop or the turn, just either for value or protection. Spade draws probably don't check it down at this point. And I kind of feel the same way about overpairs. So even though this feels a little optimistic, I don't hate this call just because he's not really representing much at all. And given his stack size to start the hand, I think he certainly could be defending hands like queen jack, king jack, and then obviously like king queen, ace queen, and hands like that. The problem here is if he's kind of just making some rando bet with like 2s, 3s, 4s, a6, stuff like that. So, this is close-ish, I think. I think I end up calling and being wrong, but such is life. On the upside, if you're going to be wrong, do it at the smallest stakes that you're playing at the time. Pro tip. Yeah, he ends up having queen 10, which kind of surprised me, but kind of confirms the pre-flop read. Bottom left, just going to 3-bet King Jack offsuit small blind versus button. I don't really want to flat there just because I expect a decent amount of squeezes, even though it's 50 cent a dollar. 50 cent a dollar is probably... I mean, I haven't played 50 cent a dollar in ages, or 25.50 or any of the other lower ones, but I would assume that by 50 cent a dollar, people are still able to kind of look for good spots to squeeze and play aggressively pre-flop and stuff like that. So I definitely don't want to be getting overly cute trying to flat hands out of position and just hoping that people don't squeeze in spots that they should and stuff like that. Like I said, I mean, the major adjustment I'm going to be looking to make if I was to be playing these stakes more regularly would be to open buttons and cutoffs wider, and then calling buttons and cutoffs wider too. Just trying to get in spots where I have position with wide ranges, and hopefully they make mistakes post flop. So a few spots. Bottom left, I defend with 7-6 offsuit blind versus blind. I think that's pretty standard. I defend the flop, and once I get that turn, if he bets, he just wins basically. My hand just doesn't have very good equity versus even his bluffs, and he can certainly have a whole bunch of better value hands. Bottom right, I defend King 6 suited. Again, I think that's pretty standard blind versus blind. I defend on a flop of 9-6 3 two-tone, and then he bets the turn. I think I can probably fold the turn here. Yeah, and just continue with my top pair type hands, hands that have straight draws, and then all my flush draws, and I should have a whole bunch of hands that are still continuing. Top right, this one's a little iffy. I'm fine with check calling the flop or check raising. It definitely helps to make this decision if you know something about your villain. Obviously, the wider he opens the button and the more he c-bets, the more I like check raising, just because his range is obviously not as strong to be betting the flop. It also helps if he's c-betting depolarized, because then it puts a lot of his 8s, 9s, 10s, jacks, weak kings and stuff in a pretty tough spot. I don't really know what he's doing, obviously, because I've got two hands on him and he hasn't played any of them yet. So I just elect to go for the check raise, and I mean, if he 3-bets, then I'm just getting it in, but I'm not particularly happy about it. But it's it's tough to play hands where you don't have reads on people. So yeah. Oh, I didn't even see that at the time. The chat from Milsiuk, who said, "Why are you playing here?" Now, so quick chat read. I would generally say that that especially at smaller stakes, if someone does say something to you during the course of a hand, chances are they're more likely to be strong than weak. So that might have changed my thoughts on the hand a little bit. But to be honest, once I check raise, I don't think I have much of a choice but to put more money in, whether that's by calling or jamming. But I'm certainly not going to get away from my hand at that point. Bottom right, I defend a 3-bet versus Schmef with pocket 8s. Schmef, 3-bets like a lunatic from the big blind. So 8s is a complete slam dunk call. The flop's sort of a tricky spot just because he c-bets so much. It's 82% there on my HUD. But it's not like he doesn't barrel turns. So I don't think I need to defend pocket 8s, although I guess it's sort of close given that I have the 8 of hearts. But for the most part, I don't really have much of a redraw. I'd much rather have 9x, and obviously I'd be calling with that. So this is probably kind of just like the top of my folding range, I think. And I think that's okay. I get 3-bet by Milsiuk, and like I said, I don't really love this spot anymore, but there's 1350 out there, and I don't know anything about him, and there's the possibility that that he's not great. He's 4-tabling Zoom though, which makes me, I'm pretty sure he's a regular at that point, which is sort of good, I guess, because he's more likely to play a combo draw fast or potentially have a bluff. He ends up raise getting it in with Ace King. But I don't really think he has to play his hand that fast, to be honest. I think he can just call and then get it in on a safe turn. But his play's not atrocious or anything. Just taking a quick note. Those are the kind of things that are pretty important in that spot. Seeing him do something like that, if I were to be playing against him regularly, makes it so that I probably want to make a bit of an adjustment with my check raising range. I probably don't want to be check raising as many weak draws just because he's kind of going to war and not really letting me see as many turns as I might versus other players. So that causes a bit of a problem if I'm going to be bluffing, check raise bluffing him a bunch, because he's not going to allow me to realize any of my equity if he's just going to fast play every kind of strongish top pair. So I'd be more likely to not throw in as many kind of just naked gutters and stuff that he's just going to go crazy versus. I don't mean crazy in a bad way either. I just mean put a lot of pressure on me with. Top left, just standard c-bet. On the turn, I think, you know, I mean, I have equity basically. It's obviously not a great turn to barrel, but he can certainly have hands like 8-9, 9-7, king-queen, although king-queen probably doesn't fold. Random diamonds, 10x, jack-3, you know, stuff like that can all potentially find folds, although probably not jack-x. And, you know, if I get called, then I have equity, especially with the overcard as well. Bottom left, I c-bet 7-8 of hearts and villain calls. I pick up some equity with my pair, and my pair's never good at showdown, and villain's probably not likely to have too much queen 10 or too many spades in his hand, given that the ace of spades is out there. He can have hands like king queen, king jack of spades, but a lot of times those are going to check raise the flop as well. So he's in a spot where I mean, also pocket nines and ace jack are very likely to check raise the flop too. So he's very likely got a hand like queen jack suited, ace 10, potentially ace queen. But I think I should have a pretty reasonable triple barrel here, with him not being able to show up with too many strong hands. I think once on the top left, once villain calls twice, that he's very likely to have either a jack or diamonds. And versus that range, I don't think betting makes too much sense, so I'm fine with just check folding. Bottom left, or sorry, bottom right, I end up defending 5-6 suited versus a button min raise, and it goes check on the flop, and then I lead the turn. If I was slightly stronger, I think I'd probably check call the turn, but given how vulnerable my hand is and the fact that it has equity, as well as, you know, it's the best hand a decent chunk of the time, I kind of like or prefer betting here. He ends up raising to 3x, and he's not really representing too many hands. He can have a hand like king jack that's raising to get a kind of a take control of the hand, show his hand down cheaply. He can also have hands like jack 5, jack 2, jack 3, which are, you know, obviously pretty strong hands at this point. But, you know, the fact that I don't think he's repping too many hands, and I'm getting an okay price, and my 5's good sometimes, as well as the fact that I have a gut shot to, you know, which is almost always good. I think I'm okay with peeling here. The river's going to be kind of the tough spot, but we'll take that from there when we get there. Jack on the river is actually kind of good because I should be perceived to have a decent amount of jacks in my range, although, I mean, in reality, I probably check call them a decent amount on the turn, just because he can bluff and he likely doesn't have very much, and I block combos of hands that he can call down with, you know, so on and so forth. But when we do get a jack on the river, I don't expect him to bluff anywhere near as much, just because it makes it less likely he has a jack, and when I have a jack, I'm never folding. And then he bets pot, and it's a lot less appealing to call now than it would have been had he bet half pot. So I think I can just get away with folding this hand. In reality as well, I mean, my hand's not particularly strong in relation to my range here. I have a 5 with no kicker, so no problem there with just folding. Bunch of junky hands all over the place. Queen 6 suited I would defend versus a min raise, but for a 3x I think it's fine to just fold. Pocket 6s from the cutoff, going to be a standard open. If I get 3-bet, I'm probably folding versus everyone unless we end up going like raise from intense dog and then call by bitter ace, and then I'll probably come along if it's 3 ways. 7-8 suited, I I think it's close as a defend versus versus a regular from under the gun, but Villain's only playing with a $38 stack at 25-cent, 50-cent, so he's likely to be, a weaker player, unless he's a professional short stacker, but I have no reason to believe that yet. So I'm going to defend with a hand that's suited and connected and just kind of mostly play my hand for its, its actual value and not try and get too out of line. Flop seems like a pretty standard call. Backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, pair, and a gut shot. Villain ends up checking back on a jack turn. I think I have the best hand a decent amount of the time now, but can't really see too many ways that I can get value. It's hard for me to represent a bluff, and it's hard for him to call down with the worst, especially given that I have no kicker on my 7, so I just check and expect to win a whole bunch. If he bets, I am going to have a... if he bets, I think I just fold. I'm just not particularly high up in my range, and it doesn't look like a spot that seems super bluffy. The whole bet check bet thing is pretty tough, though. That's pretty opponent specific. Some people just never do it as a bluff. Some people mix it in as a bluff, a decent amount of the time. That's going to come down to reads basically. Top left, I ISO the pocket 8s. Gonna c-bet just because of how vulnerable they are, and if I can get a hand like Queen Jack, King Queen to fold, then I'll be more than happy with that. It's just really hard to bluff catch with my hand if I check back. Villain calls, and I guess it's sort of close between betting or checking. I'm fine with checking back though. Just sort of close in terms of he can have diamond draws that could potentially call again or fold. Either way, I'm pretty happy about it. And then he can certainly have hands like 6x or pocket 7s. But that being said, well, yeah, he's far more likely to have a hand like pocket 6 or pocket 7s, 6x, pocket 5s, pocket 4s than he is to have a hand like pocket 9s or 10s, just because most of those probably put in a raise. Or at least he's more likely to raise the bigger pairs than he is the smaller pairs, I would imagine, unless he's just playing some kind of weird form of backwards poker. So I could see an argument for betting the turn, but I'm fine with checking it back too. The problem with checking it back, obviously, is it makes it very difficult to bluff catch river if he bets. And if he does, then I think he's probably just going to win. Yeah, well, there you go. He bets 3x pot, or close to 3x pot, which makes my life easy. Certainly don't see any reason to bluff catch at that point. Yeah, the flush draw missed, but that's a mighty big bet, so you got to be right a decent amount more often. Ace Queen's just going to be a standard bet in the top left. Not going to defend the 4-5 suited in the top right. I think it's a little too weak. I'd defend 5-6 suited probably, so I guess 4-5's probably pretty close actually, but it's not a hand I normally defend. King 10 on the bottom right is a hand that's pretty close when it comes to defending versus the cutoff, I think, but or King 10 off anyway, but I think it's okay. I get 3-bet here versus Schmeff, and like I said before, Schmeff's certainly very capable of 3-betting light, both for value, or basically just there's a lot of bluffs in there basically, and if he happens to have a better hand than Ace King, then good for him, and hopefully we suck out. But I'm basically just gonna be 4-betting here. He also does tend to like to call 4-bets a decent amount, so there's also a lot of value in that because my hand tends to flop pretty well, and it also flops well in terms of I'm gonna hit flops that he hits, but basically hit them harder a lot of the time. So that's the added bonus of it too. The only downside, obviously, is that I'm building a huge pot out of position with a hand that doesn't actually have any showdown value a lot of the time. So yeah, we hit a king, which is nice. Makes it easier. I just check my stats quickly, and he seems like he stabs a decent amount when I check. So I elect to go for a check, hoping that he puts some money in. I think I should check call if I'm going to check, and hopefully he ends up bluffing. There's not too many cards that scare us. We'd like to see something that's not a queen, jack, or 10, but if that happens, then we're probably still stacking off anyway. At the time, this made a lot of sense to me to be checking here, just because I expected him to stab. In retrospect, I don't like it too much, just because it's a really good board to c-bet, in that he's not going to have too much king X, I don't think, in his 4-bet flatting range, and I'm going to want to see bet a decent chunk of my 4-bet bluffing range here. So I think I'm probably better off making a bet of about $33 and then, jamming turns, hoping that he floats one with basically, any pair that's 9x or better, and then some gut shots and stuff like that, and put him in a tough spot. Whereas this way, I think he's good enough to realize that he probably doesn't have a ton of fold equity by betting, and then he's built a big pot with only a pot-sized bet left, and it just puts him in a murky spot. So he checks back, and now I'm just going to make a small bet, I think, of about $30. My hand's pretty much invulnerable at this point, and I just want to make it so that I can jam river at the same time, or give the illusion of being able to jam river as well when I'm bluffing. And he thinks for a while and just types LOL, and I think he's just going to fold. So I would guess that he probably had to have something like ace queen, ace jack, but I mean, he's certainly one of the loosest players around, so he could potentially have something like 5-6 suited even. Six four suited, going to be a standard open versus pretty much all blinds there. Same thing as I've been talking about before. 6-4 just doesn't play well to check back, especially with no diamonds. So I'm just going to go ahead and bet. If I get check raised, then he can have the pot basically. And doing that, like betting a whole bunch of hands like that, does open you up a little bit to being check raised liberally versus people who are aggressive. But especially at the smaller stakes, don't worry about potential problems until you actually experience them. Same thing with people worrying about betting turns thinly for value. Don't worry about being check raised until it actually happens, because for the most part you don't have any reason to believe that that's going to happen a large majority of the time. So basically you're just you're kind of handcuffing yourself without them doing anything to warrant you being handcuffed. Same thing on the top right. King 9's probably not a hand that I would open in my regular games, I don't think, or King 9 offsuit anyway. Although it's probably pretty close, but again, I just think it's important to get in there and kind of loosen up those ranges at the smaller stakes and just play as many hands as possible if you feel confident in your post-flop game anyway. And then you can do a lot of kind of like, I like to think of it as sort of like dinking and dunking, where you just kind of put in some small bets, you check back flops. Just because you open a hand pre-flop doesn't mean that you have to put a whole bunch of money in on the flop or play super aggressively. A lot of your equity, especially, or a lot of your EV, from these late position opens is probably going to be from just your flat out steal equity, where people are just folding their button and their blinds too often. So don't think that you just gotta go crazy whenever you open a hand and just 3-barrel off all the time. You're gonna have enough hands to hit boards, and when they don't, you're still gonna get some folds and stuff. So yeah. I mean, top right back there, where I check back King 9, is just a spot where I can get value from worse, but I'm really not looking forward to getting check raised. So I think it's fine to just check back and then kind of play a pot from there. It's also good for your hands that can't really stand too much heat, to be able to check back a hand like that and then be able to call down if you want to. Bottom right, just 3-bet bluffing with 8-6 suited there. These bluffs are a lot less fun when I know nothing about the villains, just because I have no idea how wide they're going to be flatting the 3-bets. But once you get a good read for the guys that you're playing against, and start to know who's peeling 3-bets wide, who's folding a lot of flops in 3-bet pots and stuff like that, you should really start to tailor your 3-betting ranges to the specific villains, whether that be by depolarizing versus guys who are kind of stationy and peel a lot of 3-bets, or by polarizing versus kind of nittier players, and then flatting with some of the hands like Ace Jack King Queen maybe, versus like tighter cutoff opens and stuff like that, versus guys who are not defending a lot versus 3-bets. Top left, I like to just check with the Ace Jack. I don't think I really want to go 3 streets versus most people, and I give him a chance to put in a bet with some junk. He doesn't oblige though, and I'm just going to go and make a small river bet, and hopefully he looks me up with a mid pair or something. I don't think it looks super bluffy, but I mean, who knows what he's like at hand reading. Also, I don't know if I want to go with a big bet here, just because I feel like if he had a hand that was one of the better aces in his range, like ace, well, there's not tons of ace X in his flatting range is one thing, right? Because I open an early position and he flats the cutoff, so he's much more likely to have mid pairs than he is to have an ace that's worse than mine. And I think the aces that are better than mine probably bet the flop. So I think a smaller bet's in order here to try and kind of widen his calling range and get him to make kind of a stubborn call with pocket nines, pocket tens. Also, though, I mean, there's a decent amount of players out there who just are complete non-believers when you end up checking at any point in the hand. So if you can find some of those, then definitely throw some checks in there. So bottom right, I have this is pretty speculative. I'm not gonna be super behind this one, but I defend blind versus blind. I think that's okay, although it's probably close to being a hand that could be 3-bet. Villain c-bets, and he's c-bet 100% so far through the whopping 25 hand sample that I have. We have an overcard, a backdoor flush draw, and some backdoor straight draws. So I just elect to put in a raise and probably barrel turn if we pick up any equity, and if not, then probably just check back and then just give up unless we pick up a particularly good scare card, like maybe something like a queen or a king. But yeah, mostly just barreling when I pick up equity. And we get a 7, which is obviously awful. You could consider betting just to fold out stuff like 6-4, 8-9. What else? That's mostly it. There's no flush draws out there, so I don't like betting at all. I mean, he's just going to have a 10 or a 7 too often, I think, or an overpair, and none of those are folding the turn, I would imagine. And obviously I have no equity as well, so that's a nice little tiebreaker for not barreling. He ends up showing up with Queen 10, which I'm sure calls the turn, and then I don't know if it calls the river, but either way, I don't think I need to go absolutely crazy with Jack 6 high. Bottom right, button versus cutoff, super standard 3-bet with the ace-king suited there. There's a big difference between playing against the cutoff open and a middle position open for the most part, just in that the ranges are wider than they open, so therefore they're going to be defending their ranges wider and 4-bet bluffing more, it just goes on and on. So ace-king just becomes a much better 3-bet for the most part versus cutoff opens than it does against middle position opens. Unless, of course, people are just completely positionally unaware, and then, then you just look at those numbers, and that's going to change things considerably. But those numbers, I mean, their opening frequencies. Bottom right is either a 3-bet or a fold. Certainly not going to flat King 10 offsuit, especially with Schmeff and the big blind, who's going to squeeze me to death. I think if I flat a bunch here. So a few spots. Top left, just quickly out of the way, just a standard 3-bet. For value / bluff. I mean, either way, I'm happy with him folding or him calling. Bottom right, this is a board that shouldn't hit him much at all. He can have 2s, 4s, and 6s in his range certainly, but he's gonna have not very many 4x apart from maybe like ace 4 suited. Same thing with 2x, and then for 6x he's gonna have some 6-5 suited and 6-7 suited. So especially if he's not going to be defending ace highs on this board, which it's very possible he's not. I don't know anything about this guy, but if he's a regular, then I think I have a pretty good chance of being able to get through this board with a c-bet. So I'm just going to make a half-pot c-bet and hopefully take it down. And obviously I've got 2 overcards for the times that he has, 7s, 8s, 9s. Or like 6-5 or something. It's not a board that I'm going to be particularly happy to barrel on, though, just because I expect to have decent fold equity on the flop. So it's sort of similar to those spots that I've talked about in the past in the forums and on in videos, where if you expect to have a bunch of fold equity on an earlier street, when you get to the later street, you probably don't want to be bluffing a whole bunch just because you're up against a pretty strong range. 3-4 suited, just completing just because we're 4 ways, and I'm not going to make a ton of mistakes, I don't think, with 3-4 suited there, where I'm going to put a bunch of money in when I catch a 3 or something. I'm basically playing my hand hit a straight or a flush. King 6 offsuit is a hand that's pretty close if I know something about the big blind. I think I should just fold, given that I don't know anything about him. Jack 10, standard open from the cutoff again. I'm going to be checking back this flop all day. I don't expect to be able to be called by worse very often unless the villain's really loose, but again, don't have any stats on him. So I'm just going to kind of play my default strategy versus a regular. I can call on most turns unless, unless it's like a king or a queen of diamonds or something, I guess. I expect a lot of villains to just kind of throw out a bet after I check back. And yeah, getting check raised on that board sucks, even though I shouldn't expect it a whole bunch. So once he checks, it's kind of interesting as well, because if I don't expect to ever get check raised, I think I'm better off just betting for protection / thin value. Sometimes when you check back here, you just get called by like pocket 5s and pocket 6s, just people thinking you always have king queen or queen 10. So there's value in that, but given that there's 2 flush draws out there, there's certainly a whole bunch of hands that he could be check raising, where it becomes a whole lot less appealing to put that bet out there. But basically, if you're playing against a villain who's got a really low check raise turn stat over a decent amount of hands, then you're probably better off to bet here, because even if he has ace-x, he's only getting 1 street out of you, and you can choose to check back the river, or if you hit a jack or a 10, you can value bet. And then the times that he has, 8s, 9s, 6s, 5s, 4s, I mean, you potentially get a call on the turn that you wouldn't necessarily get on the river, and you deny those hands their small chance of hitting a set on the river. So that's just kind of a minor consideration. He calls, and once he calls, I'm just not putting any more money in. Yeah, so he called with pocket 9s, which kind of shows what I was saying. I mean, he ended up binking a set on the river, but that hand basically played out how we wanted to play out versus his range. So again, a lot of these spots, I've got a bunch of close spots for whether or not to be 3-bet bluffing from the blinds, but so much of that, for me anyway, comes down to tailoring my 3-bet bluffing range to the opponents that I'm playing, and that's going to be really tough, like I said before, against opponents that I have 2 and 10 hands on. So for those of you who are playing these stakes regularly, like I said, just really look out for that, and look for guys that are opening wide, or that are defending too much to 3-bets, or that never 4-bet bluff, those kind of things. Especially the lower you're playing, the more likely you are to find people with substantial leaks in either their pre-flop or post-flop game. Top right, king queen suited is a pretty standard flat there, I think, versus a cutoff open. Ace 4, okay, so bottom right, ace 4 of hearts. I get a really good flop for me. It's a situation where I'm not going to be able to go 3 barrels unless I hit a flush, basically, which, I mean, is going to happen like 33% of the time or whatever it is. But I think this is a really good hand to have in my check calling range, just because I never have to fold a turn, and I nut up on rivers and turns that I'm not expected to nut up on. And this is especially more of a consideration the higher you go, as people start to hand read better and put more pressure on you when your hand ranges are weak. So I think this play has a lot more merit at, say, 1-2 than it would at 10 cent, 25 cent, where you're probably better off at 25 NL just betting, hoping that they make loose calls on multiple streets, than trying to get them to put too much money in with weak ranges because you look weak. Now, obviously, that stuff is somewhat player dependent, but as a whole, I think that generally kind of holds true. Top right's going to be interesting. I'm not sure what I do if... I'm going to go on a limb and guess that Frankie, 4 bets, because I don't remember having to make a decision on whether or not to call or fold. If Frankie hadn't 4 bet in the top right, I think I should be calling if one or either of them, or basically no matter what Frankie does, I think as long as he doesn't 4-bet, I think I should be calling with the button and a hand like king queen suited, and then kind of just hoping to hit something decent. Bottom right, villain bets flop and then bets only $6 on the turn. I mean, you almost want to check raise here just because he's shown himself to be so weak, but my hand's not particularly vulnerable, having the heart draw to go along with my top pair, and my kicker kind of sucks, so I think calling's probably the better play, and then pretty much calling on almost any river. In fact, I can't really think of a river I wouldn't call on. maybe a 7 or a 5, based on his small bet sizing here, makes it more likely that he's kind of going for thin value with something, or protection, or I don't know what. Once you play your hand like this, though, it's pretty tough to get away from him. And then he bets $12, and there's just absolutely no chance of him folding for that price. He ends up showing up with a backdoored straight. But that just kind of shows you how, I mean, that doesn't show you, but him showing up with that hand shows you how important it can be to develop a decent check calling range, just because he put in a flop bet with a hand that has pretty much no chance of improving. He basically just had a backdoor straight draw. And was, some of those outs aren't even good because of my hearts. So he got there, but a lot of times he's just going to end up putting in bets completely dead with close to no fold equity. I mean, if you're defending enough of your checks, if you're defending, about half of your checks or something like that, they're just going to be putting in a lot of bets with kind of no equity, dead hands, and that works out pretty well for us. So I think this is a pretty good time to stop for this first part of the multi-stake Zoom series. But as usual, if you guys have any questions or comments or any suggestions, just feel free to leave those in the comments section, and I'll get back to you guys as soon as possible. This has been James Hudson, or iRunLucky, for RunItOnce.com.